Major funding for these broadcasts has been provided by grants from New York Community Bank, AmTrust Title Insurance Company, Perfect Building Maintenance, M&T Bank, Customers Bank, Marks Paneth LLP, Capital One Bank, Collins Building Services, Meridian Capital Group, Sterling National Bank. Additional support has been provided by grants from AKA Hotel Residences, Corman Communities, Ariel Property Advisors, Amarant Bank, Bank of America Merrill Lynch, Briarwood Organization, Chase Commercial Mortgage, Chase Commercial Term Lending, Citizens Bank, Dime Community Bank, Douglaston Development Levine Builders, Flushing Bank, Friedman LLP, Handler Properties LLC, Handler Real Estate, Hodges Ward Elliott Inc., Investors Bank, James D. Kuhn Real Estate Institute at Syracuse University, Keysight Capital Partners, Matone Group LLC, New Banks, Newmark Knight Frank, Ocean First Bank, Optimum Window Manufacturing Corp., People's United Bank, Rockefeller Group, Rosewood Realty Services, Stonehenge NYC, SVN CPEX Real Estate Services, Terra CRG, the Marengo Family Foundation, and these friends. Brooklyn, New York, Great Neck, New York, Kings Point, Great Neck North, I believe. I really want to go to Cornell, but I'm going to go to Syracuse. Syracuse, Columbia Law, Columbia Masters, real estate, practicing law, tax credits. I have Paul Richman, who is the chairman and founder of the Richman Group companies. So tell me about the family. Tell me about your father's side first.
Well, my grandfather was an accountant, and he was here many, many years ago. I think he was maybe born here back in the 19th century. And my father was a master's of economics, and he met my mom, I guess, in college. It was probably Brooklyn College, and then he went into sales and marketing. He was a very good salesman.
For the bicycle company.
For the bicycle, Stelber Industries, which became an American Stock Exchange company. And then he left Stelber to start his own company, marketing exercise bikes.
Right, he was like the pre-Nordic Trek, right?
Yes, I think he may have introduced the first exercise bikes in the country. And he also, I think, had something to do with training wheels on bicycles. He was a very smart guy. And he had the Sears Roebuck franchise, because they would sell their own brand. And so he supplied these exercise bikes.
Your mother has an interesting background.
Yes. My mother was adopted at a very early age, about 3 years old, by a very prominent Brooklyn Jewish family. And they were, she told me, very wealthy. And then her father died, and she graduated high school at, I think, 14 years old, and started college. I think that's where she met my father, because he was 3 or 4 years older. And she then, later on, got her master's in psychology. So both my parents had graduate degrees, which for that day and age was a little unusual. And so she practiced psychology for a while. She's also a very talented woman, very good in the arts. She was virtually like a concert-level pianist. She painted, She designed jewelry. Very, very talented person.
So now let's talk about your parents were living in Brooklyn when you were born.
Correct.
Okay? And at the age of 2, they moved to Great Neck.
Correct.
So tell me about growing up in Great Neck for the first couple of years.
Well, it's very different than it is today because it wasn't that well developed until after World War II. And so it was a little bit like Greenwich, where I now live. It was fairly rural. People still had some farms. And we moved to a development that was being built in what they called the Baker Hill section, which was right near the elementary school where I went. Then when I started, I guess, junior high school, in those days you didn't have middle school, you had junior high school. About that time we moved to Kings Point.
Now, you were telling me when we got together that you were track and basketball?
Track and basketball. And my two brothers were both very good basketball players. And my middle brother particularly, he was much taller than me. My son's almost 6'5". So everyone always asked me, where did you get the height from? And I said, hey, it's from the genes. Unfortunately, I didn't have the height. They both ended up playing a bit of college basketball. And I was I could shoot very well, but I was a backbencher. So I was not as talented at basketball. I was okay compared to them, and I tell people that that was one of actually the positive experiences I had in life, because I thought that later on, if you're going to be an entrepreneur, it's sometimes good not to be the most successful at things when you're younger, because you learn to not have fear.
But now, when you were young, you have a couple of experiences which have effect on your life later on, but one of them was one summer in summer camp you had this guy Larry David, right?
That's correct. I was a bunkmate of Larry David, and I like to tell people that he was the same person you see today, only he was probably in his early years.
You got involved with politics because you were a big advocate and follower of JFK and Robert Kennedy.
That's correct. My mom was a very big reader. She also traveled the world in an era when people really did not travel much. And by 7 years old, I get up early and watch the Today Show with her. So she got me very interested in public affairs at a very early age.
Now, let's talk about that, because during high school you were active in politics also?
Correct.
Or was it later in college?
No, at the end of high school, Bobby Kennedy changed his residency to run for the Senate. And he didn't do it from Massachusetts, he did it from New York State. So I was in the Young Democrats in high school, one of the leaders, and I first got involved in politics working on his campaign for Senate.
Now, so you graduate high school, and you wanted to go to Cornell, but Cornell didn't really want you, or there was a combination and you ended up at Syracuse.
No.
Tell me the situation.
Well, my father had his ups and downs in business. As a result, they used to give you a test, I don't know if they still do it, and I won a scholarship. So there was a big incentive for me to go in New York State, and my brother had gone to Cornell. And so I had very good grades and good board scores. I did not particularly have a good grade in French in high school in 10th grade. I was lucky that they passed me, because I don't have a good ear for foreign language. So I switched to Latin, which I did well on because you didn't have. So I really wanted to go to Cornell as my first choice. But about, I guess, June of my senior year in high school, I found out I didn't make the cut. And so I ended up going to Syracuse, where I had a very nice education experience.
When did you get the decision that you wanted to be a lawyer?
And I think it was due to JFK, because public service was a very important thing in that era of the Kennedys. And I figured if I went to law school, that would be a good way to be in public service. And my grandmother told me before she died that Judge Benjamin Cardozo, one of the most famous judges from New York and on the United States Supreme Court, was a relative of our family.
So you graduate Syracuse. Now it's a decision that you want to go to law school. There was a place called Yale,
Right.
and there was a place called Columbia. How did the decision end up that you ended up at Columbia?
Well, one part of it, which I like to say, is that, again, one of my disappointments is I didn't get into Cornell when that was really my choice, having my brother graduated from there. And so at least there was something in life that the way things work out. The first law school that admitted me was Cornell. So I said, okay, the second time I made it around. And then along with a bunch of other schools, I got into Columbia. Okay, so I applied to Columbia Law School. And from my work on the Kennedy campaign for president, I was asked if I'd want to work for Admiral Linsky, who had been, along with Jeff Greenfield, two of the young, really, brainiacs for Bobby Kennedy. And he was running for Attorney General of New York State. So I worked on that campaign, and he had a very tough challenge to win and beat the Attorney General, and he didn't. But from there, someone asked me if I'd like to meet this gentleman called Howard Samuels, who had served for Secretary of Commerce under Lyndon Johnson, and he was going to be running for governor. So I met Howard. He was a very dynamic man.
Now, Howard was interesting because he was a dynamic individual, but also the person who created baggies, right?
That's correct. The story is that he did his thesis at MIT, did this significant paper on using resin to make plastic bags. And then he served in the Army, and I think for General Patton. And after he got back, he started the Cordite Company, which he sold to Mobil Oil, I think in the late 50s, around 1960, for hundreds of millions of dollars, which is a lot of money now, but it was certainly a lot of money in today's dollars back then. And he did that, and he was interested in public service, and he was appointed by Johnson to be Secretary of Commerce, and was going to run for governor in New York because he came from Rochester, and that's how I met him.
You finished Columbia.
Yeah, I'm still at Columbia Law School
Right.
when I'm working for him.
Right.
But the election wasn't going to be until 1974, and there was a gap between when I would graduate law school and when I would be there for the election, and I wasn't going to leave after having worked for a couple of years on the campaign. And so I had a friend of mine who was in the JD MBA program, joint degree, which you could do in 4 years instead of 5 if you took an extra year and went to business school. And he told me, he said, Richard, why don't you go get an MBA as part of the joint program, and then it will match when the election will be, and you'll graduate with the joint degree. And I was always very good quantitatively, so I figured business school might be something.
And it was
interesting
also
to me.
a way to avoid entering the military.
Well, actually, no, because I was lucky about this. They had gotten rid of graduate deferments. At the end of my freshman year in law school, Nixon introduced the draft lottery, and I got 333, which meant there was no way you're going to be drafted.
You practiced law for a couple of years. Okay, how do you get into the housing business?
Okay, well, I was at Columbia, and I don't remember which school. They happened to have a course on affordable housing finance, because Lyndon Johnson, as part of the Great Society, had started a program called 236, which is a big affordable housing production program. And in taking the course, I was fascinated by the whole business, that you could sell the tax shelter and build a development for low-income residents. You didn't really need much capital because you got the capital from selling the tax benefits. It was very legally oriented subject matter. It was also very financially oriented subject matter, so it was right up my alley. And you could become very profitable doing it, which I thought was a good side thing.
So how did you meet Steve Ross?
Okay. In the campaign of Howard Samuels for governor, he had a bunch of young people on his finance committee. And I was asked to be the counsel to the finance committee because this is right after the whole Watergate problem. And New York State had passed a new finance law for political contributions, and nobody knew anything about it because it was brand new. So Howard said to me, I'd like you to figure out what this is about. So I became counsel to the finance committee, and a lot of well-known people who were then young were on that finance committee. One was Steve Ross. One was Alan Patrikoff, who's now obviously famous for venture capital. There was someone named Donald Trump on that finance committee. And so I became friendly with Steve while he was a contributor and raising money for Howard. Okay, so Steve actually gave me some legal work when I was then working at practicing law. And my brother, my middle brother, went into textiles and then venture capital. He gave me some legal work, so I actually had some clients working for one of these well-known firms, and we just became more and more friendly. We ended up having a summer house together for about 4 years.
Which is how you met your wife.
And my wife, we were looking for some women to be in the summer house, and another friend of mine from law school recommended her. He had known her. And so that's actually when I first met my wife. And then Steve was working with the Section 8 program. And he convinced me that this was the greatest affordable housing program that the government had ever created. And he was going to build his company really off of
right. So initially it was affordable housing, okay? Tax shelters, okay, and funding.
Right.
Okay, and that we have a picture of you in the funding company, the related funding.
Right. So Steve kept on saying to me that he would want me to come in as a junior partner and work in this area. I actually, by coincidence, had done a little work in it when I was studying it. And I realized he was a visionary and that it was a great opportunity. So I told the partners at my law firm I was leaving to join up with Steve.
So when do you decide to start the Richman companies?
Well, being the youngest of three brothers, both who were very successful in their own fields, I had a psychological problem because I was always the younger brother. And so I had an independent streak that I liked to do my own thing. So I had a great relationship with Steve. I learned a lot. I think I contributed some to the company. And I decided that it would be great to start a business in the affordable housing sector.
So what is this, in the mid-'80s?
This was in the early 80s. And there had been someone at the company related who was there almost from the beginning, who was a junior partner named Bob Wilder. And Bob coincidentally came to me and said, why don't we start a business? It'd be really interesting to do. No issue we had at all being at related. We just wanted to sort of have the challenge of doing it.
Right. Now, let's talk about what the Richman Company is today.
Well, we're very much patterned after the progression of the related companies because we use the affordable housing business to create capital and go into the market rate luxury area, which we do today too. But one of the ideas...
You do business in 49 states, right?
We do business in 49 states because we have investment funds in the tax credit area. We don't develop in 49 states. We develop on the West Coast, Colorado, Texas, Florida, and the Northeast, principally.
And today, what are you doing? Some major projects you're doing here?
Well, we're doing a project on 125th Street, which the first phase is now going up. It's over 400 units. In total, the project's going to have about 1,000 units of mixed income and 225,000 square feet of retail space. And on the block next to us, which was part of the original development, there's the new Proton Center, right, which is a cancer treatment center.
Let's talk about how you started giving back. I know you've been very helping the community. I think it was it was 2011, he made a significant contribution to Columbia University. Talk about that.
Well, first of all, I've been involved with a lot of the nonprofits that we do business with, because the nonprofits are very important in terms of affordable housing in the United States. And then I had been on the board of the Columbia Law School, and they thought it made sense, the two deans, the dean of the law school and the dean of the business school, that the two schools work together more closely. And so someone from the business school said, would you like to meet Glenn Hubbard, who was the dean of the business school? And Glenn is famous because he was the chief economic advisor to President Bush. And so we met, and I liked Glenn very much, as well as then Dean Scheiser, who was the dean of the law school. And they asked me if I'd be on the board of the business school, which I did. And then the two deans said, since I was, I think, the only one that was on the board of both schools, if I'd be interested, with my interest in public policy, to help found the center at Columbia, which is now called the Richman Center for Business Law and Public Policy.
And what is the purpose of the Richmond Center?
It has several purposes. One is it's the place that the law school and the business school, in terms of course development, work together. It's also the center we now have a 3-year joint JD MBA program and the traditional 4, which I did. That connection is really through the Richmond Center. And we also create research and hold conferences and bring in speakers on public policy issues. Ironically, this coming Monday, we're doing a major conference discussing the different aspects of the Green New Deal up at Columbia University.
Now, you're also involved with University of Pennsylvania, NYU Langone Medical Center.
Correct. Well, my wife and I have a very sort of unusual scholarship program for kids who need financial assistance to the law school. It's really a leadership program, and at any one time we could have up to 15 students in that program, and that's been one of my most favorable experiences, getting to know these kids.
You said to me your wife is on the board of the Kennedy Center, I believe?
She was on the board of the Kennedy Center because she was a very early supporter of President Obama.
And we have a little photo of you and the president.
Yes, kidding around at our house in Connecticut one of the times he was there.
So let's talk about your wife and your son and daughter. Tell me about them, and your granddaughter.
Well, my wife got her MBA from Stern, and she's now on the board of Stern, so we have representation.
She used to be a teacher at Lubin School at Pace.
Yes, and then when I got involved in the business school at Columbia, they met my wife. Unlike law school and medical school, even today, there is not a 50-50 representation either among the professors or among the student body of women compared to men. And so they said to Ellen, why don't you teach at Columbia Business School? Because we're looking to expand our women faculty. And she had been teaching at Pace's Business School. And since we live in Greenwich, Columbia is actually quite close.
Let's talk about your son and your daughter and the grandchild.
Okay. Well, my son went to Wharton undergraduate, and he got involved during his college years in a summer job at Lehman in credit derivatives, CDS, which became very famous in the financial crisis.
Right.
In fact, although I'm very involved in finance, I had heard about CDS, and people said, well, where did you learn about it? And I said, from my son, who was interning at Lehman during that summer. And then he got into proprietary trading at a very early age. Scott Richman.
Right, and he's with the Whitehaven Fund?
He's the founder of Whitehaven Asset Manager, which is a hedge fund in New York.
And he's married to?
Laura Hovis.
Right, and they have?
One child who just turned 1.
CJ, right?
CJ, and she came from Dallas. and we've just experienced the first birthday.
Okay, and your daughter? Tell me
My
about
daughter went to Penn, and I thought she wanted to become a history professor. She was a very strong student there. In fact, was asked if she wanted to be nominated for a Rhodes Scholarship. But her friends were all interviewing at the time, this is during the financial crisis, at consulting firms and finance, investment banking. So she said to me one day, "Dad, I think I'm going to interview on Wall Street." And I said, "Wait a second, you're interested in history. You're a history major."
What is she doing?
So she ended up going to Citicorp, and she was working in the bond field in retail bonds, and decided she wanted to actually go into business. So she worked for Theory, the fashion company, and saw that Columbia has a program for entrepreneurship in retail.
Okay, and her name?
Brooke Richman.
Okay.
So she graduated Columbia Business School, and she started her own firm, Coop and Spree, which is in the fashion industry, catering to young women and young moms.
So I think you've gone a full circle from Brooklyn to to Greenwich to Washington, D.C. and around. And thanks for being here today.
Thank you.